The rain fell in steady sheets across the abandoned mining settlement on Kepler 442b, each drop creating tiny explosions of red dust on the barren ground. In the shadow of a collapsed storage facility, a figure huddled against the corrugated metal wall, her pale blue skin mottled with darker patches where injuries had begun to heal badly. Zara pressed her three-fingered hand against the plasma burn on her shoulder, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her slender frame. 3 standard days had passed since her transport crashed during the evacuation of Rigel Prime, and she had been hiding here ever since, surviving on rainwater and the few emergency rations that hadn't been destroyed in the wreckage. The Zarathi refugee had fled her homeworld when the Galactic Coalition arrived with their promises of protection and their demands for compliance. Like so many others, she had believed their propaganda about creating safe zones for displaced populations. The reality proved far different. The Coalition treated refugees as burdens, herding them into camps where basic dignity became a luxury reserved for those who could pay the bribes. Through the skeletal remains of mining equipment, Zara watched the Coalition patrol hover vehicles drift between the abandoned buildings. Their sleek, silver hulls reflected the gray sky as they conducted their routine sweeps. The Vorthan soldiers inside those vehicles wore expressions of boredom mixed with contempt whenever they spotted human colonists going about their daily business. New Terra Colony had been established by humans from Earth nearly 50 years ago, carved from the hostile landscape through determination and backbreaking labor. The settlers had built something remarkable here, a thriving community that welcomed refugees from across the galaxy, offering shelter and opportunity to anyone willing to contribute to the collective effort. That openness had made them vulnerable when the Coalition arrived. The human settlement sprawled across the valley floor, its prefabricated structures connected by covered walkways designed to protect against the planet's frequent storms. Gardens grew in hydroponic domes, their green leaves a stark contrast to the red soil outside. Children played in carefully maintained parks while their parents worked in workshops and laboratories, maintaining the delicate balance that kept their world functioning. Above it all, on a tall pole in the central square, an Earth flag snapped in the wind. The red, white, and blue fabric had faded over the decades, but the colonists maintained it with religious devotion. It represented not just their heritage, but their values, freedom, justice, and the belief that every being deserved the chance to build a better life. The Coalition commanders had tried to remove that flag 3 times since their arrival. Each time, the colonists had replaced it within hours, their quiet defiance becoming a source of growing irritation for the occupying forces. Zara shifted position carefully, trying to relieve the pressure on her injured leg. She had been a xenobiologist on Rigel Prime before the war came to her doorstep, studying the fascinating ways different species adapted to harsh environments. Now she was just another displaced person, invisible to those who held power and abandoned by those who claimed to protect the innocent. A sound made her freeze, the distinctive whine of Coalition hoverbikes approaching. 2 Vorthan soldiers emerged from between the buildings, their reptilian features hidden behind reflective visors. They moved with the casual arrogance of occupiers, secure in their technological superiority and their authority to go wherever they pleased. The lead soldier gestured toward a pile of human belongings that had been left behind during a recent security sweep. Personal photographs, children's toys, and handwritten letters lay scattered in the mud, treated as debris rather than treasured memories. The soldier kicked at a child's stuffed animal, sending it flying into a puddle where it landed with a wet splash. His companion laughed, the sound carrying clearly across the empty space. Humans attach such ridiculous importance to these objects, he said in the universal trade language, his voice distorted by his helmet speakers. It's no wonder they're so emotionally unstable. At least they're easier to manage than the Zarathi, the first soldier replied, using his weapon to poke through the scattered belongings. Those blueskins think they're too good for the relocation camps. They keep trying to integrate with human settlements instead of accepting their proper place. Zara's throat constricted. She knew exactly what proper place meant in Coalition terminology. The camps where her people were dying of neglect and despair, warehouse-like inventory waiting to be processed. The soldiers continued their patrol, their voices fading as they moved deeper into the settlement. Zara waited until the sound of their hoverbikes disappeared completely before allowing herself to relax slightly. She needed medical attention soon, but approaching the human colonists would put them at risk of Coalition retaliation. The occupying forces had made it clear that harboring unauthorized refugees carried severe consequences. As the afternoon wore on, more Coalition patrols passed through the area. Their presence had increased dramatically over the past week, and the tension in the settlement was becoming palpable. The humans went about their daily routines with forced normalcy, but Zara could see the way they glanced nervously at their flag whenever the soldiers appeared. The flag itself had become a source of particular interest for the coalition forces. They would slow their vehicles when passing the central square, their faceplates turning upward to stare at the defiance symbol fluttering above the community they now controlled. From her hiding place, Zara watched a group of human children playing in one of the enclosed gardens. Their laughter echoed off the dome walls as they chased each other between the hydroponic towers. For a moment, she was transported back to her own childhood on Rigel Prime, before the wars and the displacement and the endless running from one temporary sanctuary to another. One of the children, a girl with dark hair and enormous brown eyes, noticed her watching. Instead of calling for adults or showing fear, the child simply waved. It was a small gesture, but it represented everything the coalition was trying to destroy: spontaneous kindness between strangers, connection across species lines, and hope that tomorrow might be better than today. Zara raised her good hand and waved back, feeling tears threaten behind her large, dark eyes. In that simple exchange, she found something she had thought lost forever: the reminder that not everyone in the galaxy had given up on the principles that made civilization worth preserving. The shadows were growing longer when she finally spotted the figure approaching from the eastern edge of the settlement. At first glance, he looked like any other human colonist: medium height, dark hair, wearing the practical clothing favored by people who work with their hands. But there was something different about the way he moved, a fluid precision that spoke of extensive training and countless hours of practice. Marcus Chen had arrived on the morning transport from the orbital station, carrying papers that identified him as a mining engineer looking for work. The coalition guards had barely glanced at his documentation before waving him through, their attention focused on more immediate concerns. But Zara's trained eye caught details that others might miss. The way his gaze constantly swept his surroundings, cataloging potential threats and escape routes. The careful positioning of his hands near concealed pockets that might contain weapons or tools. The measured pace that would allow him to accelerate instantly in any direction. This was no ordinary colonist. As evening approached and the settlement began to quiet down, Zara made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't remain hidden much longer, and her injuries needed attention regardless of the risks involved. If this newcomer was what she suspected him to be, he might represent her only chance of survival. More importantly, he might be the catalyst the settlement needed to reclaim its dignity. The coalition's patrols were becoming more aggressive, their contempt for human symbols more openly displayed. The flag in the central square had become a focal point for their frustration, and Zara had heard enough of their conversations to know that a confrontation was inevitable. When it came, she hoped someone would be ready to stand up for the principles that flag represented. Someone trained to fight back against overwhelming odds and equipped with the skills to turn the tide when courage alone wasn't enough. As darkness fell over New Terra Colony, Zara began to plan her approach to the mysterious newcomer, unaware that her decision would soon transform a quiet act of defiance into a legend that would spread across the galaxy. Marcus Chen stood at the edge of the settlement's main square, his engineer's coveralls still damp from the afternoon rain. To any observer, he appeared to be studying the layout of the mining infrastructure, occasionally making notes on a weathered tablet. In reality, every fiber of his being was focused on the tactical situation unfolding around him. 48 hours had passed since his arrival on Kepler 442b, and his assessment of the coalition occupation grew grimmer by the hour. The aliens had positioned themselves with textbook efficiency, controlling key transportation routes and communication nodes while maintaining a visible presence throughout the settlement. Their hover vehicles patrolled on predictable schedules, creating an illusion of overwhelming force through careful timing and positioning. But Marcus saw the weaknesses in their deployment. The coalition soldiers relied too heavily on their technological advantages and showed the kind of complacency that came from facing no organized resistance. They moved in patterns that could be exploited, communicated on frequencies that could be intercepted, and, most importantly, they underestimated the humans they had come to control. The Navy SEAL had volunteered for this assignment after reading the intelligence reports coming out of the outer colonies. The coalition's expansion was accelerating, and their treatment of refugee populations had reached levels that violated every principle the United Earth Alliance held sacred. Someone needed to assess the situation firsthand and determine whether covert support for the colonists was feasible. What Marcus found exceeded even his worst expectations. During his first evening in the settlement, he had witnessed a coalition patrol stop an elderly human woman who was carrying medical supplies to her sick neighbor. The soldiers had confiscated the medicine, claiming it might contain contraband, then left the woman standing in the rain while they debated whether to arrest her for suspicious activity. The next morning, he watched them destroy a memorial garden that the colonists had built to honor their dead. The aliens claimed the site violated new regulations about unauthorized structures, but their real motivation was clear: eliminating anything that might serve as a rallying point for human identity and resistance. Each incident was carefully calculated to demoralize the population without quite crossing the line into open brutality. The coalition understood that martyrs could be dangerous, so they preferred the slower method of grinding down hope through 1,000 small humiliations. But their greatest mistake was failing to recognize that some forms of hope were harder to kill than others. Marcus had been watching the flag in the central square since his arrival, noting how the colonists' eyes turned toward it during moments of stress or uncertainty. The coalition commanders had obviously identified it as a symbol of defiance, but they couldn't simply tear it down without risking the kind of dramatic confrontation that might spark wider resistance. Instead, they were trying to make it irrelevant through contempt and mockery. Each patrol that passed through the square would find new ways to demonstrate their disrespect for the human symbol. Soldiers would aim their weapons at it during training exercises, use it for target practice with non-lethal rounds, or simply laugh and point whenever the wind caused it to flutter. The psychological warfare was subtle but effective. Several colonists had already suggested removing the flag voluntarily to avoid further provocation. The community was beginning to fracture along lines of fear and pragmatism, exactly as the coalition intended. Marcus knew he needed to act soon, but his orders were clear: observe and report unless the situation became critical. The United Earth Alliance couldn't risk an international incident based on one man's judgment, no matter how experienced he might be. Everything changed when he discovered the wounded Zarathi refugee. He had been conducting a perimeter sweep in the abandoned mining sector when movement caught his attention. Years of training had taught him to distinguish between the random motion of debris and the deliberate actions of a living being. Someone was trying very hard to remain hidden among the wreckage, and their efforts suggested both intelligence and desperation. Finding Zara huddled in her makeshift shelter, Marcus felt the last of his restraint crumble. The alien's injuries were severe enough to be life-threatening without proper treatment, but approaching the settlement's medical facility would expose her to coalition attention. She had been surviving on rainwater and willpower for days, slowly dying while the very forces that claimed to protect refugees hunted for unauthorized aliens to relocate. "You're hurt," Marcus said quietly, using the universal trade language and keeping his hands visible. "I can help." Zara's large eyes studied him with surprising intensity, as if she were conducting her own tactical assessment. "You are not what you appear to be," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way you move, the way you observe, you are military." Marcus felt a flicker of professional respect. The alien was clearly intelligent and observant, qualities that would make her a valuable ally if the situation deteriorated. "I'm whatever the settlement needs me to be," he said carefully. Over the next few hours, as Marcus provided basic medical care for Zara's injuries, she shared her observations about the coalition's operations. Her scientific background had given her a unique perspective on their tactics and technology. More importantly, her experiences as a refugee had shown her the true face of the coalition's humanitarian mission. "They are building something," Zara explained as Marcus cleaned the plasma burn on her shoulder. "The patrols have been increasing, and I have observed them installing new equipment at the communication center." "This is not routine occupation behavior." Marcus nodded grimly. His own reconnaissance had revealed similar preparations, but Zara's intelligence filled in crucial gaps. The coalition wasn't just maintaining order in the settlement, they were preparing for something bigger. The question was whether they planned to use New Terra Colony as a staging ground for further expansion or as an example of what happened to communities that showed insufficient cooperation. Either way, the timetable for action had just accelerated dramatically. As the third day of his stay dawned clear and cold, Marcus watched the morning patrol begin their rounds with unusual enthusiasm. The Vorthan soldiers were laughing among themselves, their body language suggesting anticipation rather than routine boredom. They spent extra time in the central square, circling the flagpole with obvious intent. The senior sergeant, a scarred veteran whose nameplate read Fax, gestured toward the flag with what might have been amusement. His squad gathered around him, their weapons held in casual ready positions that could be brought to bear instantly if needed. Marcus positioned himself in the maintenance shed adjacent to the square, using his tools as cover while he observed the developing situation. Around the square, human colonists were beginning their daily routines, but their movements had the forced quality of people trying to appear normal while anticipating trouble. Thax pulled out a small device and aimed it at the flag. A targeting laser painted a red dot on the fabric, dancing across the stars and stripes with deliberate precision. His squad members laughed as he traced patterns on the symbol, turning their people's most sacred emblem into a toy for their amusement. "Look at them," Thax said loud enough for nearby humans to hear. "They still think this piece of cloth means something. They still believe their primitive nationalism can protect them from the reality of coalition authority." One of his subordinates, a younger soldier with elaborate tattoos covering his scales, stepped forward with an energy weapon. "Perhaps we should demonstrate the futility of their attachments, Sergeant." The command staff grows tired of this daily provocation. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the setup. This wasn't random harassment, it was a carefully orchestrated event designed to break the colonists' spirit once and for all. The coalition had decided that subtle psychological warfare wasn't working fast enough, so they were escalating to a more direct approach. Around the square, human civilians were beginning to gather despite the obvious danger. Children pressed their faces against dome windows while their parents tried to pull them away from the scene. Elderly colonists who remembered Earth stood with tears in their eyes, watching their heritage about to be desecrated by aliens who viewed human dignity as an inconvenience. The moment stretched taut as Thax raised his weapon toward the flag, his finger moving toward the firing stud with theatrical slowness. The message was clear: this symbol of human defiance would be destroyed, and anyone who objected could face the same fate. Marcus felt the familiar calm that came before action settle over him. His orders were to observe and report, but those orders hadn't anticipated watching the systematic destruction of everything America claimed to represent. Sometimes a Navy SEAL had to trust his training and his conscience more than distant bureaucrats who had never faced the reality of oppression firsthand. The coalition soldiers had made their choice when they decided to mock and humiliate innocent civilians. Now Marcus would show them what happened when their victims possessed the training and equipment to fight back. As Thax's weapon reached firing position, Marcus stepped out of the maintenance shed and into the square. His coveralls were gone, replaced by tactical gear that had been carefully concealed in his mining equipment. The rifle in his hands was a piece of Earth military engineering that the coalition had never encountered, designed specifically for asymmetric warfare against technologically superior opponents. "Sergeant," Marcus called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "I think you dropped something." Thax spun toward the voice, his weapon automatically tracking toward this new threat. But Marcus was already moving, flowing through the square with the fluid precision that separated professionals from amateurs. The first shot took out the squad's communication equipment, the second disabled their hover vehicle's engine. The battle for New Terra Colony had begun, and the aliens were about to learn why humans had earned their reputation as the galaxy's most stubborn fighters. The silence that followed Marcus's opening shots lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then, the square erupted into chaos as Sergeant Thax and his squad realized they were under attack by a single human who had somehow appeared from nowhere with military-grade weapons. Thax's initial shock lasted only a moment before his combat training took over. The Vorthan veteran had survived dozens of engagements across the galaxy, and his squad represented some of the coalition's finest soldiers. One human, regardless of his equipment, should not have posed a significant threat to their superiority. But Marcus Chen had not survived 15 years as a Navy SEAL by fighting fair or following conventional tactics. The first lesson the coalition learned was that their energy shields, designed to deflect plasma weapons and standard kinetic rounds, were useless against the specialized ammunition Marcus carried. The tungsten core penetrators punched through their defensive systems like paper, forcing the aliens to rely on cover and maneuver instead of technology. The second lesson came when Thax tried to call for reinforcements and discovered that his communication array had been surgically destroyed. Marcus hadn't simply shot at random equipment, he had identified and neutralized the specific components that would prevent the squad from coordinating with their command structure. "Impossible," Thax hissed in his own language, diving behind a decorative fountain as Marcus's third shot sparked off the stone where his head had been moments before. "How does one primitive human possess such precise intelligence about our systems?" His squad was already moving to established positions, their training taking over despite the shock of facing effective resistance. They had fought humans before, but never one who seemed to anticipate their tactics and counter them with ruthless efficiency. Marcus used their moment of reorganization to assess the developing battlefield. The central square offered multiple sightlines and approaches, but it also left him exposed to crossfire if reinforcements arrived. His advantage lay in mobility and the element of surprise, both of which would diminish rapidly as the enemy adapted to the new threat. The human colonists had scattered at the first sign of violence, but Marcus could see faces pressed against windows and doorways. They were watching their flag flutter above the chaos, perhaps beginning to understand that someone was finally fighting back against their oppressors. From her concealed position in the abandoned mining sector, Zara observed the battle through a pair of salvaged optical enhancers. The Zarathi refugee had seen enough conflicts to recognize superior tactics when she witnessed them, and the humans' performance was nothing short of extraordinary. The coalition soldiers were moving according to standard doctrine, using their technological advantages to establish overlapping fields of fire while advancing on the enemy position. It was textbook military strategy, the kind of approach that had given them victory on 100 different worlds. But Marcus wasn't where they expected him to be. The fourth shot came from an entirely different angle, dropping one of Thax's flanking soldiers before the alien even realized his position had been compromised. Marcus had used the fountain's decorative stonework to mask his movement, repositioning himself while the enemy focused on his last known location. "He's using the terrain features," Zara whispered to herself, her scientific mind analyzing the tactical display. "Their doctrine assumes technological superiority will overcome environmental disadvantages, but he's turning their assumptions against them." The fifth shot disabled another soldier's weapon, leaving the alien alive but combat ineffective. Marcus could have killed them all within the first 30 seconds of engagement, but he was making a different kind of statement. This wasn't about body counts, it was about demonstrating that the coalition's apparent invincibility was an illusion. Thax was beginning to understand the same thing. His squad had been reduced by half in under a minute, and their opponent showed no signs of running out of ammunition or tactical options. The sergeant had to choose between continuing an engagement he was clearly losing or withdrawing to regroup with reinforcements. The decision was made for him when Marcus's next shot punched through the hover vehicle's fuel cell, causing a spectacular explosion that sent debris raining across the square. The blast wave knocked two more coalition soldiers unconscious and left Thax temporarily blinded by smoke and flying sparks. "Fall back," the sergeant ordered, his pride warring with tactical necessity. "Establish a perimeter at checkpoint 7 and await backup." But, as his surviving soldiers attempted to withdraw, they discovered that retreat was not going to be as simple as advance had been. Marcus had used his initial assault to herd them into a kill zone of his own design, using the square's architecture to limit their escape routes. The seventh shot came from above as Marcus used his climbing gear to reach an elevated position on one of the maintenance towers. From this vantage point, he could observe the entire square while remaining concealed from ground-level observers. Thax looked up just in time to see the muzzle flash and threw himself sideways as the bullet sparked off the flagpole inches from his head. The symbolic nature of that near miss was not lost on either combatant. The human was defending his people's flag with the same precision he brought to everything else. "You cannot win, human!" Thax shouted, genuine frustration creeping into his voice. "We have superior numbers, superior technology, and superior firepower. This meaningless gesture will only bring harsh retribution on your people." Marcus's response came in the form of actions rather than words. His eighth shot disabled the targeting system on Thax's personal weapon, followed immediately by a ninth that destroyed the sergeant's communication headset. Each strike was precisely calculated to degrade the enemy's capabilities without causing unnecessary casualties. Around the square, the human colonists were beginning to emerge from their hiding places. The sight of one man holding off an entire coalition squad had transformed their fear into something approaching hope. Children pressed closer to windows while their parents struggled between caution and the desire to witness this unprecedented display of resistance. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the settlement's senior administrator, watched from her office window with growing amazement. She had known Marcus for only 3 days, but had recognized something familiar in his bearing and manner. Now she understood why he had reminded her of her brother, who had served with the Earth Defense Forces before the coalition's arrival made such organizations politically inconvenient. "He's not just fighting them," she whispered to her aide, who was documenting the engagement with a hidden recorder. "He's embarrassing them. Making them look incompetent in front of everyone they're supposed to be controlling." The aide nodded nervously, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the recording device. "What happens when reinforcements arrive?" "They'll bring heavy weapons, air support, maybe even orbital bombardment. One man can't stand against an entire occupation force." Dr. Mitchell considered that soberly, but her eyes remained fixed on the figure moving with deadly grace through the chaos of the square. Maybe not, she admitted. But sometimes one man is enough to remind everyone else that they don't have to kneel. Marcus was thinking along similar lines as he prepared for the next phase of the engagement. His tactical computer showed multiple coalition units converging on the square from various directions, their estimated arrival time forcing him to make critical decisions about his next move. He could disappear into the settlement's underground maintenance tunnels, using his knowledge of the infrastructure to evade capture while planning future operations. That approach would keep him alive and operational, but it would leave the colonists to face coalition retaliation for his actions. Alternatively, he could continue the engagement, using his skills to inflict maximum damage on the enemy forces while the opportunity presented itself. That path would likely result in his death or capture, but it might also demonstrate that human resistance was possible even against overwhelming odds. The choice became clear when he spotted Thax pulling out a thermal charge powerful enough to level half the square. The coalition sergeant had abandoned any pretense of restraint and was preparing to destroy the entire area rather than suffer further humiliation. Marcus had seen enough of the galaxy to know what happened when occupying forces decided that examples needed to be made. The thermal charge wouldn't just destroy the flagpole, it would kill dozens of innocent civilians and reduce their community center to radioactive rubble. The 10th shot was the most difficult of Marcus's career, requiring him to thread the needle between Thax's position and a group of human children who had emerged from a nearby building. The bullet struck the thermal charge's arming mechanism with surgical precision, disabling the weapon moments before it could activate. Thax stared at the ruined device in disbelief, his tactical mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The human had somehow identified his weapon, calculated its effect radius, and neutralized it with a single shot taken from an elevated position under combat conditions. It was the kind of marksmanship that required not just exceptional skill, but an intimate understanding of coalition military equipment and procedures. This was not a lucky amateur or a desperate civilian, this was a professional soldier with training and equipment that matched or exceeded their own. As the sound of approaching reinforcements grew louder, Marcus prepared for the most challenging phase of the battle. The easy part was over, now he would have to prove that human ingenuity could triumph over superior numbers and technology. From her hiding place, Zara watched the human check his equipment and adjust his position with the calm confidence of someone who had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. For the first time since fleeing Rigel Prime, she began to believe that the coalition's expansion might not be as inevitable as everyone assumed. The reinforcements arrived in 3 waves, each more heavily armed than the last. Marcus watched from his elevated position as coalition hover vehicles surrounded the square with military precision, their crews deploying portable energy barriers and setting up overlapping fields of fire that would make movement across open ground virtually suicidal. Captain Vex, the coalition's senior commander on Kepler 442b, emerged from the lead vehicle with the deliberate movements of someone accustomed to absolute authority. His species, the Krillian, were known throughout the galaxy for their tactical brilliance and their complete inability to tolerate challenges to their supremacy. Human, Vex's voice boomed across the square through amplified speakers, "You have demonstrated impressive skills, but your position is hopeless. Surrender now, and your death will be swift rather than prolonged." Marcus responded by putting a rifle round through the captain's personal communication array, a shot that required threading the needle between 2 overlapping energy shields while accounting for wind drift and target movement. The message was unmistakably clear: the human had no intention of surrendering, and his capabilities were far beyond what the coalition had initially assessed. Vex's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or fury. "Very well. You have chosen the difficult path. Squad leaders, implement Protocol 7. I want this entire area swept clean within the next 10 minutes. Protocol 7 was the coalition's standard response to organized resistance. It involved systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, followed by mass detention of any survivors who might harbor sympathy for the insurgents. The doctrine had proven effective on dozens of worlds, breaking the will of local populations through overwhelming displays of force. But Protocol 7 assumed that resistance would come from desperate civilians using improvised weapons and guerrilla tactics. It was not designed to counter a professional soldier with advanced equipment and intimate knowledge of coalition procedures. Marcus had spent the brief lull between engagements preparing the battlefield to his advantage. Using his engineering credentials as cover, he had spent 3 days mapping every utility tunnel, maintenance access, and structural weakness in the settlement's central district. Now those preparations would determine whether his defiance became a futile gesture or a genuine threat to coalition control. The first wave of assault troops moved forward in textbook formation, their energy shields providing mobile cover while support weapons laid down suppressing fire from fixed positions. They advanced with the confidence of soldiers who had never faced serious opposition, their movements coordinated but predictable. Marcus let them close to within 50 meters before triggering the first of his surprises. The settlement's water distribution system had been designed with multiple pressure release valves to prevent damage from the planet's seismic activity. By carefully adjusting those valves and timing his intervention precisely, Marcus transformed the square's decorative fountains into improvised weapons. High-pressure water jets erupted from concealed nozzles, striking the advancing coalition troops with enough force to knock them off their feet and short-circuit their electronic equipment. The attack was completely unexpected, turning the aliens' own momentum against them as they struggled to maintain formation on suddenly treacherous footing. But Marcus wasn't finished with the utility systems. The settlement's power grid included an emergency shutdown protocol that could isolate different sectors in case of equipment failure. By triggering that protocol selectively, Marcus plunged portions of the coalition perimeter into darkness while maintaining illumination in areas where he needed to observe enemy movement. The psychological effect was immediate. Coalition soldiers found themselves stumbling through unfamiliar terrain while their target remained invisible in the shadows, striking at will before melting away into the infrastructure maze he had turned into his fortress. Captain Vex watched his disciplined assault dissolve into chaos and felt the first stirrings of genuine concern. The human was not simply fighting, he was orchestrating the entire battlefield like a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. Every system the coalition had dismissed as primitive civilian infrastructure was being weaponized against them with devastating effectiveness. "Sir," one of his lieutenants reported over the tactical network, "we've lost contact with Squads 3 and 7. Squads 2 and 5 are reporting equipment malfunctions. Should we request heavy weapons support from orbital assets?" Vex's mandibles clicked thoughtfully as he considered the implications. Orbital bombardment would certainly eliminate the human threat, but it would also level most of the settlement and potentially kill hundreds of civilians. Such extreme measures would require extensive justification to his superiors, particularly since the official reports had described this as a routine pacification operation. Negative, he decided. Deploy the hunter teams. Use non-lethal weapons to minimize collateral damage. I want this human taken alive for interrogation. The hunter teams were Vex elite soldiers, equipped with advanced sensors and specialized weapons designed for capturing high-value targets. They moved through the settlement with inhuman grace, their enhanced senses tracking heat signatures and movement patterns that normal troops would miss entirely. Marcus detected their deployment within minutes and smiled grimly. The coalition was escalating their response, which meant his demonstration was having the desired effect. They were being forced to commit their best assets against a single opponent, resources that could otherwise be used to suppress civilian populations across multiple star systems. But the hunter teams represented a genuine threat that required immediate attention. Using his knowledge of the settlement's construction, Marcus descended into the maintenance tunnel network that connected every major building. The tunnels had been built wide enough to accommodate repair robots and emergency evacuation, giving him freedom of movement while remaining invisible to aerial surveillance. The first hunter team entered the tunnel system at Junction Alpha, their enhanced senses immediately detecting traces of human presence. They moved forward in perfect coordination, their weapons set to deliver paralytic charges that would incapacitate without killing. They never realized that Marcus had turned the tunnels into a three-dimensional maze designed to separate and isolate individual targets. Emergency blast doors, originally installed to contain pressure waves from mining accidents, could be triggered remotely through the settlement's central computer system. Marcus had spent hours programming new activation sequences, creating the ability to seal off tunnel sections at will. The hunter team found themselves divided by massive steel barriers that dropped from the ceiling with mechanical precision. Individual soldiers suddenly faced the prospect of single combat against an opponent who knew every inch of the terrain and had chosen the engagement parameters to his advantage. The first hunter went down to a perfectly placed tranquilizer dart, Marcus's own non-lethal ammunition proving superior to alien technology designed for the same purpose. The second tried to retreat and found his path blocked by another blast door that had sealed behind him moments after he passed through. One by one, the elite soldiers fell to an opponent who used their own tactical doctrine against them. Marcus moved through the tunnels like a ghost, striking from unexpected angles before disappearing into passages that his targets didn't even know existed. Above ground, Captain Vex received increasingly frantic reports from his hunter teams before communication with them ceased entirely. His most elite soldiers had simply vanished into the settlement's infrastructure, leaving no trace except for brief energy signatures that suggested they had been systematically neutralized. How is this possible? Vex demanded of his tactical officer. One human cannot defeat an entire hunter squad armed with military-grade equipment. The answer came in the form of Marcus Chen emerging from a maintenance hatch behind coalition lines, appearing like a specter among soldiers who thought their perimeter was secure. His rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, disabling the command vehicles targeting computers and communication relays before he vanished back into the tunnels. From her hiding place, Zara watched the coalition forces struggle against an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The human's tactics reminded her of stories she had heard about ancient Earth warriors who used knowledge of local terrain to defeat vastly superior armies. But this was more than just guerrilla warfare. Marcus was conducting a masterclass in asymmetric combat, demonstrating that advanced technology meant nothing without the tactical intelligence to use it effectively. Every coalition advantage was being turned into a liability through creative application of principles they had never encountered. Dr. Mitchell observed the battle from the settlement's administrative center, documenting everything for the historical record that future generations would need to understand this moment. Around her, colonists who had spent months living in fear were beginning to stand straighter, their voices carrying new notes of hope and defiance. "He's not just fighting them," she whispered into her recorder. "He's teaching us that they can be fought. That we don't have to accept their occupation as permanent reality." The lesson was being learned throughout the settlement as humans who had forgotten their own capacity for resistance began to remember what their ancestors had accomplished through determination and courage. The flag still flew above the chaos, untouched and defiant, a symbol of principles that no amount of alien technology could truly defeat. Marcus knew that his ammunition and energy reserves were finite, that eventually the coalition would adapt to his tactics and overwhelm him through sheer numbers. But his mission had never been about winning a conventional military victory. It was about proving that human spirit could not be broken by those who mistook technological superiority for true strength. As evening approached and the battle entered its final phase, Marcus prepared to make the last stand that would either secure his legend or provide the inspiration needed for others to continue the fight. The coalition had committed nearly their entire garrison to capturing or killing one man, and their failure to achieve that objective was sending shockwaves through their command structure. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon had never been technology or numbers. It was the willingness of individuals to stand against impossible odds when the cause was just and the alternative was surrender to tyranny. Captain Vex stared at the human flag fluttering in the evening breeze and felt something he had not experienced in his decades of military service, the growing certainty that this battle was slipping beyond his control. The final confrontation began as the twin suns of Kepler 442 beset behind the settlement's skyline, casting long shadows across a square that had become the focal point of something much larger than anyone had initially understood. Captain Vex stood beside his remaining command vehicle, his tactical display showing the complete failure of every conventional approach to neutralizing a single human opponent. Around the square, his forces maintained their positions with growing uncertainty. 3 full squads had been neutralized or incapacitated by an enemy who seemed to possess intimate knowledge of both coalition tactics and the settlement's infrastructure. Equipment worth millions of credits had been disabled by improvised weapons and creative applications of civilian technology. But the true cost of the engagement was becoming clear in ways that had nothing to do with military casualties or damaged equipment. Throughout the settlement, human colonists were emerging from their homes and gathering in the streets. They moved with the careful deliberation of people who had made a fundamental decision about their future, their faces showing determination rather than the fear that had characterized their behavior since the coalition's arrival. Dr. Mitchell walked through the crowd, documenting their transformation with the kind of scientific precision she had once applied to geological surveys. The change was measurable and profound. People who had spent months avoiding eye contact with coalition soldiers were now staring directly at alien patrols, their body language radiating defiance rather than submission. "It's remarkable," she whispered to her recorder. "One man's courage has reminded an entire community that resistance is possible. They're not just watching him fight, they're remembering how to fight themselves." Near the edge of the crowd, Zara had finally emerged from her hiding place to witness the conclusion of the battle that had transformed her from refugee to symbol. The Zarathi scientist moved carefully through the human gathering, her pale blue skin and obvious injuries drawing sympathetic attention rather than the suspicion she had expected. An elderly colonist named Robert Chen approached her with medical supplies, his weathered hands gentle as he examined her wounds. "You've been hiding out there for days, haven't you?" he asked in accented trade language. "Why didn't you come to us for help?" Zara met his eyes with surprise, seeing genuine concern rather than the calculated indifference she had grown accustomed to from other species. "I did not wish to bring coalition retaliation upon your people," she replied honestly. Robert's laugh was bitter but warm. "Look around, child. The retaliation is already here. But so is the response to that retaliation. Maybe it's time we all stopped hiding from what we know is right." As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus Chen appeared at the edge of the square, his tactical gear dusty and his ammunition nearly exhausted, but his bearing still radiating the calm confidence that had carried him through the day's impossible challenges. The crowd parted to let him pass, their faces showing a mixture of awe and gratitude that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Captain Vex saw the human approaching and felt his strategic calculations collapse into simple, primitive anger. This single opponent had humiliated the coalition's finest soldiers, turned their technological advantages into liabilities, and, worst of all, demonstrated to an entire settlement that their occupation was not the inevitable reality it had been presented as. "Enough," Vex announced through his amplification system, his voice carrying across the square with metallic authority. "Human, you have fought with skill and courage, but this charade ends now. Surrender immediately, or I will authorize the orbital bombardment that should have been used hours ago." Marcus stopped walking and studied the alien captain with the kind of professional assessment that made Vex's subordinates shift nervously. When he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the square without amplification, audible to every human and alien present. "Captain, you seem to be under the impression that this was about me winning a military engagement against your forces." Marcus's smile was tired but genuine. "Let me clarify the situation for you." He gestured toward the human colonists who had gathered around the square, their numbers growing by the minute as word spread throughout the settlement. This was never about one Navy SEAL taking on the coalition military. This was about reminding these people that they have the right to stand up for their principles, their homes, and their dignity. Marcus pointed to the flag still flying above them, its fabric snapping in the evening breeze with defiant vigor. "You came here to destroy what that symbol represents, the idea that free people have the right to govern themselves according to their own values. But every shot you fired, every threat you made, every moment you spent chasing one man through these tunnels was a demonstration that your authority depends on fear rather than legitimacy." Around the square, the human colonists were beginning to stand straighter, their voices joining in a low murmur of agreement that grew stronger with each passing moment. They were no longer spectators to the confrontation, they were participants in their own liberation. Zara found herself standing beside Dr. Mitchell, two very different species united by their recognition of something profound occurring before their eyes. "He is not just fighting for victory," the Zarathi scientist observed quietly. "He is teaching them that they never needed permission to resist tyranny." Dr. Mitchell nodded, her fingers working furiously to capture every detail of the moment for posterity. "That's what makes him dangerous to them. Not his weapons or his tactics, but his example. They can replace destroyed equipment, but they can't unshow people what courage looks like." Captain Vex felt the situation slipping beyond his control as he watched the crowd of humans grow larger and more confident. His tactical computer was showing energy signatures that suggested more coalition reinforcements were en route, but he was beginning to understand that military solutions would not resolve the fundamental problem this human had created. "You cannot stand against the full might of the coalition," Vex announced, but his voice lacked the absolute certainty it had carried earlier in the day. "We have ships, armies, weapons that can crack planets. What can one settlement possibly accomplish against such power?" Marcus's response came not in words but in action. He walked to the flagpole at the center of the square and stood beneath the symbol that had become the focal point of the day's struggle. Around him, the human colonists began to move closer, forming a protective circle that made the message unmistakably clear. "You want to destroy this flag?" Marcus called out to Vex. "You want to break these people's spirit and turn them into another conquered population? Then, you'll have to go through all of us to do it." One by one, other voices began to join his declaration. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward first, followed by Robert Chen, then dozens of other colonists who had decided that some things were worth the risk of standing up for.
Even Zara moved to join the circle, her presence adding symbolic weight to the growing coalition of those who refused to surrender their dignity to alien occupation.
Captain Vex stared at the crowd surrounding the flagpole and felt the weight of an impossible choice settling on his shoulders. He could authorize the orbital strike that would eliminate the entire settlement, but such an extreme response would require extensive justification to his superiors and might spark wider resistance across the sector. Alternatively, he could attempt to extract his forces and report the situation as contained, but the damage to coalition prestige had already been done. Word of a single human holding off an entire garrison would spread throughout the galaxy, potentially inspiring similar resistance movements on other occupied worlds. As he weighed his options, Vex received an unexpected communication from his command ship. Admiral Krex, the coalition's senior commander for this sector, had been monitoring the situation and reached his own conclusions about its implications. Captain Vex, the admiral's voice crackled through the damaged communication system, you will withdraw your forces immediately and establish a perimeter around the settlement.
Do not engage the humans further without direct authorization from High Command. Vex's mandibles clicked in confusion.
Sir, the situation is well within our capabilities to resolve. A single orbital strike would eliminate the resistance and restore proper order.
Negative, Captain.
Our intelligence indicates that Earth Alliance vessels are moving toward this system in response to reports of the engagement. This situation has escalated beyond a local police action. We are withdrawing to await reinforcements and new orders from the Coalition Council.
As the coalition forces began their systematic withdrawal from the settlement, the humans around the flagpole maintained their protective circle.
They had not won a military victory in any conventional sense, but they had accomplished something potentially more significant. They had refused to be conquered. Marcus Chen stood beneath the flag he had sworn to protect and felt the satisfaction that came from a mission accomplished. The Navy SEAL had been sent to assess whether resistance was possible. Instead, he had demonstrated that resistance was inevitable wherever free people encountered tyranny. Around him, the colonists of New Terra began planning for the uncertain future they had chosen over the comfortable slavery they had rejected. They would face retaliation, siege, and possibly destruction, but they would face it as free beings who had remembered the power of standing together in defense of shared principles. And, throughout the galaxy, the story of their choice would spread to other worlds where other people faced similar decisions about whether comfort was worth the price of dignity. The coalition had come to Kepler 442b to add another conquered population to their empire. Instead, they had created the spark that would eventually consume their ability to rule through fear alone. As the twin suns finally set over New Terra colony, the human flag continued to fly above a community that had rediscovered its courage. The battle was over, but the war for the soul of the galaxy had only just begun.